Thank you for being with us for the 9th month podcast in the Digging Deep Bible Study for Men. Today we're studying You Shall Not Commit Adultery, and we're thankful to have Chris Lydon with us, filling in for Ben Gisselbaugh. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Hate that Ben can't be with us, but I'm thankful for the opportunity to help.
It's great, and we want to remind everyone that we have the podcast videos available on our YouTube channel now. If you go to YouTube and search for Digging Deep for Men Bible Study or just Digging Deep Bible Study Men, you will find it. I could give you the URL, but it's easier probably just for you to search for it and find it, and you will see the same little icon that you see associated with the podcast if you see it in other ways, or if you look on our Facebook page, you'll see that too. And you can see all the video podcasts that we've done, going back even to the first year of our study, with the exception of a couple months where we had technical difficulties. You should be able to see all of those there. And then you can get the audio from our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So we're trying to make the podcast widely available. And remember that the podcast is for anyone who would like to study these topics. You don't have to be a member of our Facebook group, per se, in order to use the podcast, or even to use the study notes. The Facebook group is just for any of us who want to discuss the material, but we want it to be widely disseminated. So we appreciate your help on that, and if there are men in your congregation who might want to join a men's Bible study group, then we would recommend Digging Deep. Okay, Chris, as we think about our command that we're going to discuss today, it occurs to me that 7 of the 10 commandments are phrased negatively, and 3 of the commandments are phrased positively. That is, 3 of them say, here's what to do, you shall do this, and then 7 of them say, you shall not do this. But at the same time, and God is infinitely wise in phrasing them however He wants to do, at the same time, when we think about a command that says, you shall not commit adultery, we could say the positive emphasis there, or the positive implication of the podcast, of the command is, you shall have proper respect for marriage.
Right.
And if we do have the proper reverence for this institution of God's design, then we would never commit adultery.
Sure. And then originally it was stated positively if we go back to God's institution of marriage.
Right. Genesis 2:24.
Sure. It was stated in the positive. And like you said, God has His reasons for stating it in the negative, especially maybe with the Israelites being in Egypt and maybe becoming more familiar with adultery there, and the practice of adultery or marriage in whatever way the Egyptians held marriage, and also looking forward to the time they were going into the land of Canaan and going to be facing new peoples and their ideas of marriage and what is right and what is wrong. And so God may be giving that statement there in the negative for those purposes.
And in whatever society we live, the devil is going to try to get us to devalue marriage and make exceptions to the vows that we make when we enter that covenant. When we think about one of the passages we're going to discuss today, Proverbs 5-7, where the Proverbs writer gives all sorts of warnings about specific things that we shouldn't do because these things could lead to fornication. The Bible is so good about saying, here's what you should honor, here's how you should think about this, but then at the same time, don't take this step and don't take this step, because God understands that we're weak and sometimes we're tempted by things that we don't endorse intellectually. We say to ourselves, I don't believe in adultery, I oppose those who would treat marriage as if it's a small thing, I have the right belief about it, but we struggle with desire sometimes. And we struggle with the temptations that the devil would place. So the Bible says, think about marriage the proper way, but also don't do these specific things. Don't commit adultery, but then also don't have the desires. Don't put yourself in the situations that would lead you to it. And even in the 10 Commandments, we have, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. So God is addressing the actions themselves, the specific deeds that we could do, the adultery itself, but then He's also addressing the heart that would lead to it.
Yes, and that the fact that the heart is addressed in the Old Testament and not just the New Testament, which I think we'll spend some time talking about, but that, and going back to the positive side, they still had the knowledge of the garden and God instituting marriage, and that was stated positively. And we could say from that there's faithfulness, there's a commitment to this lifelong relationship. And so here, it wasn't that God changed the law or anything. This was supplementing that, not just you are to be one flesh, you are to leave father and mother and be joined to this one, but also this idea of you shall not commit adultery in that.
Right. Marriage and God's rules about marriage were part of the patriarchal covenant, and here they're part of the Mosaic covenant, and they're going to be part of the Christian age as Jesus gives his final law for marriage in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5:32 and other passages. Chris, sorry.
Okay.
I talked to Ben a lot on here.
Yes.
Chris, I had the diggers look into the part in the Sermon on the Mount at the end of the study from last year, where we made a list of the things that were new teachings that Jesus gave, and where Jesus was just clarifying what the Old Testament had already said. Mm-hmm. And I did that because I wanted to, in light of our command that we're studying, to emphasize that Old Testament and New Testament alike teach that our hearts need to be in the right place. If our outward actions are the right ones, but we're doing it for the wrong motives or without the right motives, then we're not pleasing to God. And as we looked into that, I'm reminded of Leviticus 19:2, where we read that the Israelites were to be holy as God was holy. And Jesus says in Matthew 5:48, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, be complete like he is. And so that reminded me that the basic principle of Old Testament ethics and New Testament ethics is the same, be like God, and the golden rule, which is another way to summarize both Old Testament and New Testament ethics, is the same. Jesus gave it and said, this is the law and the prophets, and Paul re-emphasizes it in Romans 13. So the basic idea of being faithful to God, loving God first, loving your fellow man second, that goes whether we're talking about the old law or the new law, and God is concerned with our heart being in the right place, whether we're talking about the law of Moses or the law of Christ.
Yes, and as you said, the heart was obviously addressed in the Old Testament. It wasn't just the outward appearance or the outward keeping of the laws. And maybe the reason that it seemed like Jesus was emphasizing the heart so much, well, one, because out of the heart come all these other issues. But you think about the Pharisees and others who were overemphasizing and creating new traditions that went against God's word of the physical. And Jesus says, hey, don't lose sight of the heart. And the same goes true with adultery and what we read about in the Old Testament. Jesus didn't come up with a new teaching when he says that adultery starts in the heart. That's in the Old Testament. And again, Jesus emphasized that, and Jesus did give final teachings on marriage. But that the issue of adultery starting in the heart is found in the Old Testament.
Right. And the idea that we should love the wife of our youth, here we're thinking about love the first wife that we're committed to, and honor the covenant with her, as Malachi 2:13-16 says. God treated marriage as a covenant that we should honor in the Old Testament. He treats it that way in the New Testament. But, Chris, the attitudes about marriage in our society are going in the other direction. Mm-hmm. I had the diggers look into research that would suggest that people's attitudes in our society toward marriage are degrading it. And you can see that in a number of ways. The moral acceptability of divorce in the United States is going up. I mean, it doesn't make divorce more morally acceptable, but the attitude toward it is that it's more acceptable. And then when we look at people cohabiting, those numbers are going up. People think of cohabiting as being like a good training ground for marriage, but of course the Bible doesn't treat it that way, because as we could study in a variety of passages, sexuality is relegated to a God-honoring marriage, or a marriage that God approves. Also, people who get divorced and remarried are statistically more likely to treat divorce and remarriage, as the best option when they find marital difficulties in a subsequent marriage. Those statistics are going in that direction. You can find these things from the Pew Research Center and various other sources, the Gallup organization. So we have to make sure, doubly sure, in our contemporary environment, as people treat marriage as being disposable, that we take God's perspective of it and taking our marriage vows seriously.
Yeah, and you scratch your head and sometimes wonder, how can we reverse this? Because it is so bad. I mean, it's the worst in the United States as far as divorce rates in the world, and that you would think not. I mean, as far as many of us still viewing this nation as a Christian nation, but ultimately it has to go back to, as you said, honoring God and honoring His institution. He instituted marriage. It's not a creation of man. It was created by God. And so if we're going to honor God and honor His commandments, then we're going to follow it, especially when it concerns this most sacred institution, which is the foundation of, we might say, all other human institutions, being that of the home and marriage. Right. So if we're going to have a good society, a godly society, then that means we have the right views towards marriage.
Notice this, Chris. In 2007, according to Pew Research, Americans opposed legalizing same-sex marriage by a margin of 54% to 37%. Okay, that's in 2007. Now, I'm sure you've heard this statistic or something like it. But in 2017, just 10 years later, the script had totally flipped in the other direction. In 2017, more favored 62% than opposed 32% gay marriage or same-sex marriage. So that's astonishing that in a period of just 10 years, people's view on something as fundamental as the genders in marriage could change that much. And so while we're not talking about homosexuality in particular in this podcast today, it just shows you that people have cut themselves loose increasingly from the biblical model of marriage.
Sure. And you wonder, and I don't know if there's a causation or even correlation here, but you see in that same time period the rise of social media as well, because it was just getting its starts back around 2007.
That's right.
And, of course, people being able to express views and maybe see views and read views that they've never heard before.
Well, and the maturation of the millennials and even Generation Z following them shows a stark uptick in approval of homosexuality. And to the degree that millennials and those after them, and I'm a millennial, I'm not bashing millennials. I'm barely one. I'm almost too old. But at any rate, there's such a sharp uptick in that generation in approval of homosexuality. And to the degree that they're disseminating their views on social media and sharing them and encouraging one another, then I can certainly see how there could be a correlation and even causation there. Okay, what about the biblical phrase, playing the harlot? This comes up over and over again. For example, in the book of Judges, the Israelites played the harlot, and I came up with several different sins or types of unfaithfulness that are called adultery in the Bible. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's literal physical adultery, although in some cases with idolatry that was involved. But when we spiritually apostatize from God, then God thinks of us as committing adultery. Because remember, the Greek word and the Hebrew words for adultery talk about breaking a marriage vow. And if we are in God's family, if we are married to Christ and we leave Him, then we're spiritually committing adultery. Or if we were part of the Israelite nation during the days of the law of Moses and we left Him, God treated that as being spiritual adultery. We're thinking about, for example, Leviticus 20 and verse 6, where Moses is talking about people who would go after mediums and spiritists or people who are practicing divination. And he says, as for the person who turns to mediums and spiritists to play the harlot after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. Well, come to the New Testament and think about a passage like James 4:4. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? And Jesus in Matthew 12:39 talked about a generation that sought after a sign rather than seeking after what the sign was signifying, which would be Jesus's authenticity. Some people just wanted to see what they thought of as being like a miracle show, like Jesus was doing some type of parlor tricks or something. And Jesus said, an evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign. So here were Jews who should have been prepared to take the miracles of Jesus as signs that he was the fulfillment of all these prophecies. And instead, they couldn't get past, wow, this is a great thing to look at, so please do another one.
Sure.
You know, as if he's a magician. In Mark 8:38, Jesus said, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So we need to make sure that we're not ever committing spiritual adultery. Now, if we commit physical adultery, we're committing spiritual adultery. That's rebellion against God. But we could, don't you think, Chris, be saying to ourselves, well, I would never cheat on my wife. But we could cheat on God by committing spiritual adultery, even though we don't do anything that would break a marriage vow in that strict sense.
Or to think that God created the institution of marriage where you are to remain faithful unto death. And that somehow our commitment to God demands somehow less devotion. I mean, think about that. God gave us the institution of marriage, but even more than important than our covenant and relationship with our spouse is our covenant and relationship with the Father. And if we're going to give devotion and love and faithfulness to our spouse, how much more so should we give devotion to the one who created that institution and created us?
That's right.
And so marriage was intended to reflect that relationship between God and his people.
Imagine a person, Chris, who is faithful to his wife in the sense that he doesn't commit adultery, but is a wayward member of the church. Isn't that an inconsistent picture? Someone who says, I could never commit adultery against my wife, but I've left the Lord. Well, a person is saying, I'm honoring a covenant because, at least ostensibly, that's something that God set up. That's really where the sanctity of marriage is grounded, is in the mind of God and not in the customs of men. So I'm going to honor that, but dishonor God otherwise. That would be a tragic circumstance.
Sure, and the reasons behind that, we don't know. It could be that that person doesn't know necessarily God's covenant and God's institution of marriage, but culturally, maybe that person knows that it's wrong to forsake a spouse or to go on. Maybe that's what they were taught by their family. Mm-hmm. But it's very inconsistent to say, I'm going to give such devotion to this person and to this relationship, and I would never think of being unfaithful, and then deny the one who created both the person and the institution, and that's not right. Give the same or even more devotion and faithfulness to God.
Right. Perhaps the part of the Bible where we see these two concepts of spiritual adultery and physical adultery come together is the book of Hosea. And I guess we don't have time to do a detailed study of the book of Hosea, but when I think of a passage that helps us see how seriously God takes both physical adultery and spiritual adultery, it would be that passage. And maybe it's because the Israelites played the harlot against God so many times, which is really what Hosea was trying to emphasize by that metaphor or picture of his own marital situation and Gomer's unfaithfulness. Maybe the reason why God allows the exception in Matthew 19 is because he has been offended so many times and takes it so seriously that the Israelites and others have been spiritually unfaithful to him, and he knows what it's like experientially. He knows everything, but he has experienced even Israel treating him that way.
And I wonder if that, I'm just thinking about this, ties into what Jehovah said to Moses when he said that he would destroy the people and he would raise up for himself another people. Right. And he's saying, look, they've gone off and played the harlot. They're already involved in idolatry and forsaking me.
He's putting them away for adultery.
Put them away for adultery, and I will raise up for myself another people. And
right.
yeah, so that's a good point. I never even really thought about it that way, and how God has been, we might say, cheated on in the past, and
right.
realizes maybe that's, again, why Jesus instituted.
And Chris and I are not making light of what happened by using a language of God being cheated on. It's not as though this is our idea. This is what the Old Testament teaches, is that God viewed it that way, as spiritual adultery. And I was thinking of how Paul felt about the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2. Paul said, "For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, for I betrothed you to one husband, so that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin." And so Paul says, you're married to one person, and one person only, because I taught you the gospel, and in a spiritual sense, I betrothed you to Christ. And so Paul had a godly jealousy over that spouse of Christ because he was involved in the betrothal. And we should have godly jealousy toward our spouses, but also godly jealousy toward any of those around us who we might be trying to betroth to Christ. It hurts us, for example, if somebody we taught about Christ goes off into another religion or becomes unfaithful, inactive in the church, because we've been pushing them in the right direction. We've been saying, you need to be married, or you are married to Christ, only to this one.
And I think in that passage, not necessarily hidden, but maybe not something we see at first glance, is how we treat those who are betrothed to Christ, and realizing that our brothers and sisters are betrothed to Christ. And you would think if I went into someone's house, I would be very careful, especially if it was in the house of a very big, strong, muscular man, how I'm going to treat his wife.
Right.
Because I don't want to disrespect her and therefore anger him.
Yes.
Well, think about this. Think about my brothers and sisters in Christ, the people I worship with, being careful how I treat them and giving them respect and honor that is due, because they are part of that bride of Christ.
And when Jesus talks about causing one of those little ones who believe in him to stumble, talking about people who are babes in Christ and causing them to sin, and how it would be better for a millstone to be hung around our necks and to be cast into the depths of the sea, you begin to see the seriousness of causing somebody who is betrothed to Christ, married to Christ, and yet we would do something to pull them away. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine a Christian using his influence? Maybe he says, well, this sin or that sin, whatever it may be, this is not that big of a deal. And here's a conscientious young Christian married to Christ, and we're saying, experiment with this sin. Just try this out. I do it. It's no big deal. Or maybe even not even saying it, just by my influence. And a new Christian looks at me and says, well, Caleb does it, and he's been a Christian for years, so apparently that's no big deal. And then before too long, they violated their conscience. I don't feel good about it, but Caleb does it, so I'm going to go along. Then they violate it again, and before too long, they're in apostasy. Spiritual adultery has occurred. It can be a step-by-step process, just as physical adultery can be a step-by-step process that starts not in the bedroom, but maybe at work or on the ball field or wherever the case may be, where those initial conversations and meetings happen.
Sure. Yeah, and thinking about my influence and what direction I'm leading other people. And as you said, maybe someone, when it comes to adultery with their spouse, maybe they hear a coworker talking about how they've been cheating on their wife or their husband. And, maybe from that starts to influence this person. They start to go off into wondering, well, could I get away with cheating on my spouse? And started having these ideas. As it says, it starts in the heart. And from the heart, these things come. So we need to be careful both when it comes spiritually, protecting ourselves, but also protecting others from going off into spiritual adultery, but also building a hedge around our own marriage and making sure that I have things in place to keep me from going off in that direction and going off into temptation. Because even the strongest among us spiritually, if they're not careful and dedicated to protecting themselves and their marriage, can go off into adultery. And we have examples of that, especially in the New Testament or the Old Testament, with men like David, who was a man after God's own heart, but he did not protect himself. He was not careful, and because of that, he stumbled and committed adultery with Bathsheba.
That's right. We got to make sure that our marriages are strong, faithful, but that doesn't happen by accident. While we're talking about the Old Testament, we want to make sure we talk about polygamy for a moment, because in the Old Testament, God did not, even though polygamy was a violation of his original plan for marriage and had terrible consequences, as in the case of David and Solomon, nonetheless, God did not punish polygamy as he did adultery, according to the law of Moses. And so I suppose that this is part of what God winked at in the ignorance of people in the Old Testament. Acts 14:16 says, in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own way. So God allowed some things in the Old Testament that he did not endorse. Polygamy was very popular way back in the earliest generations of humans. As far as I know, Lamech in Genesis 4:19 was the first one who practiced polygamy, and it says he took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And God's never been happy with polygamy, but it seems to be something that God did not treat as seriously in the Old Testament.
Sure. I guess we could say he allowed it, but he didn't endorse it. Would that be accurate?
Right. Could polygamy have been adultery? Polygamy wouldn't always be adultery under the way God viewed things in the Old Testament. But if you had a plural marriage that included somebody who was married to somebody else and broke the marriage vow that way, then that would be adultery.
And just because there was the presence of polygamy did not mean that adultery was no longer existent. And another, again, the same example, David with Bathsheba. David committed adultery with Bathsheba, but ended up marrying her later.
Right.
And she was part of that polygamy. And there's no longer adultery in that sense.
David already had various wives even before he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and the text doesn't treat David's relationship with Bathsheba in the same way that it does his relationship with all these other women. But we can obviously see the problems that resulted from polygamy, whether you want to talk about Rachel and Leah or the problems associated with the rivalry between David's wives or the problems that were introduced by Solomon's multitude of wives and how that didn't satisfy him when we read in the book of Ecclesiastes and so forth. There are a number of passages in the Old Testament that give the Old Testament law on the violation, the penalty for the violation of this commandment. One would be Leviticus 20 and verse 10. If there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. And this is why in that text that's probably an interpolation in John 8, when Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees with the woman who was caught in adultery, Jesus did not command for her to be stoned in that case because the man who was involved in the relationship wasn't present. And so it actually would have been illegal for them to carry that out. Furthermore, there was a problem with the witnesses. It seemed like this was a setup. And we don't know all the details about what happened there, but Jesus wasn't violating the principle of Leviticus 20 and verse 10. In fact, he was operating within the confines of that regulation. And we have Numbers 5, 11 through 31 with the adultery test that could be carried out by the inspiration of God with those priests and the special liquid that was used to make that determination in that passage. But again, the death penalty was not carried out in that case because the man is not present in that circumstance either. So I'll let our diggers go back and study those passages for themselves later. But marriage is a covenant, and when people broke it by committing adultery, the penalty was death, which is extremely strict.
And we don't and just because we don't see the penalty of death being in the New Testament, some might take that and say, well, God has relaxed his views on adultery and maybe even fornication and basically, if you want to feel good and be good and have all these relationships, then you go out and you do you, and having those views. And maybe even using John 8 and saying, well, look here, Jesus didn't condemn this woman. He said, where are your accusers? And but he did tell that woman to go and sin no more.
Right.
It wasn't that Jesus was overlooking her sin or didn't take her sin seriously or didn't think it was that big of a deal. No, he told her, go and sin no more. And as you pointed out, according to the law of Moses, she couldn't be stoned at that moment. And for Jesus, if he would have said, yes, stone her, he would have been violating the law. He would have sinned, which would have meant that he no longer could be our Savior.
I suppose that when Jesus asked those men, or told those men, which of you is without sin, let him cast the first stone, Jesus was implying you're having sin in this very process. You're bringing this lady up under these circumstances, probably having set her up is sin in itself. And so it's not just, I would suggest, it's not just Jesus saying, have any of you ever sinned in your whole life? Jesus is saying, you're sinners in this very context. You're committing sin by being involved in this. And so that poor lady was sinning herself, but she was also being abused.
Yes.
In the same context.
And making sure that we understand that God still has the same, we might say, hatred towards the sin of idolatry, but adultery.
Right.
That he did in the Old Testament. And although we don't go to the Old Testament for any longer for our laws on adultery, we can go to it, according to Romans 15:4 and other passages in the New Testament, to learn by example. And just as he told them, think about 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and how it was brought up there that they, played the harlot, that they also committed fornication, and they were doing ungodly sexual things. And he says, take this as an example.
Right.
Example for you as New Testament Christians. So we shouldn't look at the old and new and compare them and say, well, hey, this is great. God is a little more open-minded when it comes to sexual relations than he was in the Old Testament. He's progressing with us.
The sin at Baal Peor in Numbers 25 that's being referenced there in 1 Corinthians 10 was adultery spiritually, worshiping the Baals, but also when it says they rose up to play, we're talking about fornication occurring, and surely lots of adultery in that context as well. And if someone says God is less serious about adultery, I think I would point them to 1 Corinthians 6, where it says there in verse 10 that adulterers cannot inherit eternal life. So which is worse, being killed physically because you committed it, or not inheriting eternal life? Well, that's surely the ultimate punishment, and God's going to carry that out. Just because God doesn't require a government in the contemporary age where God's law is not the civil law of the land, where just because God doesn't require the death penalty for that says nothing about whether God's going to ultimately punish this sin. So we need to keep spiritual realities in mind, and not just the date of the cessation of my physical life, but what is going to be the ultimate punishment. Chris, what if somebody said, which is, I'm about to say something that is I think the attitude that so many people have today, that the emotion of love, the feeling of love, is the moral absolute. That is, if I feel that I love someone, I have to be true to that. That's the only thing that really ultimately matters is love. And so if I love my secretary more than I love my wife, then how could you ever condemn me for following my heart? That a person needs to be true to himself.
Yeah.
That's the moral absolute. Be true to yourself. Do what you love whom you love. And if you go against that and say that somebody should not follow your heart, then really you're just being narrow-minded and bigoted, and you're being hateful and intolerant. Just love whom you love and go with that feeling. So what if someone says that?
Well, sure. And one, we have to realize that sin can still feel good. Physically, at times, maybe even emotionally, it might make us feel good and feel pleasant. I'm assuming that, a lot of people who do drugs get some kind of good feelings out of it, or else why would they keep going back to it?
Right.
But just because you get a good feeling out of it. But then I would also say, remind someone to go back and say, who instituted marriage? And if if I understand Ephesians 5 right, and looking at the husband and wife relationship and saying, well, that here is an example, or it should point to even Christ and the church relationship. Well, let's think about that. Say I find someone or some maybe being, we might say, who gives me more pleasure than God. Can I say, well, God, you gave me this heart, and I'm going to follow my heart since I feel like I'm getting more pleasure from this idol or this false god? I'm going to go and follow it. And, well, you can't condemn me because I'm just following my heart, and it feels right. It feels good. And so that's what I'm going to follow.
Baal feels
Sure.
better to serve Baal, whatever idol you want to mention, Hindu gods, Buddha, Allah, whatever feels better to me.
Sure.
Well, clearly the question's going to come down to God's authority. Of course, there are other issues other than simply considering the authority of God. For example, in Proverbs 5 through 7, we read about even diseases that can be contracted from committing adultery, and reputation that can be ruined, and a person who is taken down to death by this lady. The pattern in Proverbs 5 through 7 is that someone is tempted by all the pleasures associated with it, but doesn't take into account the variety of consequences that come from it. And that's what we've got to see, is not just the fleeting pleasure, and that's the language of Hebrews 11:24, that there is this passing pleasure of sin, or pleasure that's but for a season, and see the larger picture of the consequences of the broken family, of the sorrow, the disease, the financial loss, the broken home, all of this that can come. That's a slew of tragic consequences of adultery. And even if we take God's authority out of it for a moment and don't even focus on that, still all of the temporal disastrous consequences, emotionally, psychologically, financially, just go on down the line, are staggering.
And when marriage loses its lifelongness, when it loses its the aspect of until death do we part, it loses, if you take that away, it loses its distinctiveness when it comes to relationships. Well, how is that any different than maybe we consider courting or dating someone? How is it different than certain friendships maybe? Well, it's the distinctiveness of being a lifelong commitment. I may say, even when it comes to friendships, that this is a good friendship that I have with someone. I'm willing to help them and serve them and even try to, bring joy and pleasure into their life. But if there's a falling out, if we just don't find as much joy in our relationship together, well, there's nothing wrong with us saying, hey, let's just go separate ways. You go your way. You found someone else that brings you more pleasure as a friend, and I found someone else that brings me more pleasure as a friend. Let's not make a big deal of this. Let's just go be with these other people as friends. And that's what is distinct. What is distinct about marriage, that it's not that kind of relationship. No one entering into a marriage gives the vow of, well, I like you now, and as long as I continue to like you, I'm going to be with you. No. Right. Even if someone doesn't say in their vows, I will be with you until death, it's still a commitment. That person saying this, I want to spend the rest of my life with you.
The whole point of it is that you're not going to bail out when it gets tough.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the occasion when we're most tempted to commit adultery would be the time when marriage has gotten tough. And we say, well, I'm not finding as much pleasure with my spouse, so let me go into another arena where actually there aren't the challenges. The thing about being home with your spouse is you're managing the finances, you're working with the children, you're keeping up with the house, you're trying to balance everything that goes on interpersonally in a marriage. But when you're having a fling with another person, you're not having to worry about the children or the household finances or getting the oil changed in the car or any of those types of things. But that's unrealistic. It's sinful. But even beyond that, you're not living in the real world when you're in a relationship like that. What we need is all of the joys that come along with the home. And we can't lose sight of the fact that we're committed to something that is in our ultimate best interest. It's not always easy, but the things that are most worthwhile in life aren't easy.
And thinking about this idea of distinction as well, what made Jehovah and the Israelites and God being who he is distinct from other false gods and other nations? Well, we have a God for this, and we have a God for that, and we have a God for all these different, and I have this God that pleases me more in this area, so I'm going to go and show them more devotion. Well, no, with Jehovah God, with Yahweh, they had one God, and if you didn't like him, if he didn't bring you the pleasure that you were wanting, well, that was too bad. He is your only option.
Right.
And again, marriage. What is marriage about?
He's the only real thing, and the marriage is the only real thing.
Yes. And so there's this idea and tying in. And why does he call idolatry adultery? Well, it's again this idea that you think that, well, here's this other god or false god who I think brings me more pleasure, so I'll just go be with them. Well, that's the same kind of justification that people use today in trying to leave a marriage in which they are to be with that person until death do they part. Is, like you said, this other person brings me more pleasure. I'm going to go be with them.
I thought it might be helpful for us to consider the contrast. As I read back through Proverbs 5 through 7, the contrast between the way chapter 7 ends in talking about the pitfalls of going after the adulterous woman, and how chapter 8 begins with wisdom calling out. Because in much of chapters 5 through 7, although there's a part of chapter 6 that deals with sloth and some other issues, but in chapters 5 through 7, we're talking about the appeal of the adulterous woman and how she tries to trick you into being with her. And then when we get to the first of chapter 8, there's another call. Whereas in chapter 7, the adulterous woman is calling out from her place, trying to get you to come in there as a foolish young man. Interesting that it's a young man who's going through this. Not that older guys can't be subject to this, but it's particularly challenging, I suppose, for those of us who are younger. And then how wisdom calls in chapter 8. So let's read beginning in verse 24 of chapter 7. It says, "Now therefore, my sons, listen to me, and pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many are the victims she has cast down, and numerous are all her slain. Her house is the way to Sheol, or the afterworld." She's going to kill you. In other words, it's like a trap. It's a trap. "Descending to the chambers of death." Then chapter 8. Okay, so she's been calling. Does not wisdom call? And understanding lift up her voice? Who should you listen to? On top of the heights, beside the way where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gates, at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out, "To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men." O naive ones. That's the person who goes into the adulterous woman's house. He's the naive one. "Understand prudence. And O fools, understand wisdom." I'll stop there, but I also want to read chapter 6, verse 32. "The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it." I think it's interesting that the Proverbs writer says you're lacking sense. He doesn't say you're offending God, which is true, but he says you're being like an idiot. You're just lacking sense because you're not seeing the consequences. You're not thinking about what it will do to you in so many different ways. And if you haven't read chapters 5 through 7, we're not going to take the time to do that, but read that passage and maybe even make a list of all of the things and say, God says this will happen to me in general terms. Maybe not every single one of these happens to every single person, but generally speaking, this is what will happen to you if you do it. And that, I think it will scare us into maintaining faithfulness if we weren't already determined to do that.
Mm-hmm. And the Proverbs, many of them written from a father to a son.
Right.
And so addressing the, why is it pointing out younger men here? Well, that's the audience. That's
right.
who he's writing to. But this idea, and you see this over and over again in the Proverbs and wisdom literature, this personification of wisdom, and that it is like this female, this woman calling out to you. And on the opposite of that, on the other side of that, is often addressed, the adulteress, the harlot, who is calling out and to this young man. And so the father here presents it to the son and saying, who you're going to listen to. Here's the benefits of listening to wisdom and instruction and following it. And here's the pitfalls, as you said, to going off into adultery and seeking after things of the flesh.
That's certainly helpful. The devil tries to desensitize us to adultery in a number of ways, trying to keep people from reading the scriptures about it. He has a way of keeping preachers from preaching on it. He has kept many leaderships in congregations in various places from practicing church discipline about it. And he has gotten the media to promote it and treat it as if it's no big deal. But and I've even heard people say things about how having affairs is just part of a healthy marriage. Well, that is the most unbiblical concept that a person could have. And also, I would just say a crazy concept if we're talking about a marriage where people are committed to one another.
You think about Satan's tactics there. If he can get us to compromise on marriage, again, a sacred institution given by God, if we can compromise on that, then it's going to be so much easier for us to compromise on other things.
That's right.
And again, Satan's always going to be attacking marriage and the church and trying to bring down those institutions because it is so foundational to so many other things.
But we don't have to heed that woman's call. That's the thing about the Proverbs is he says this woman's calling, but there's never the idea that you have to go in. You can just keep on walking. And that's what all of us should do, because there is going to be, if not an overt call, there is going to be this option for us in life. And we've got to stay true to our marriages. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for being with us. And
Glad to be
thank
here.
you for participating in the Digging Deep Bible Study for Men. And we'll look forward to our next podcast. And that will be a consideration of the 8th commandment in June. Thank you very much.